Hey, welcome everybody. Glad to have you along on this Tuesday edition of Talk Back. Good morning, Mr. King.
Hey, good morning, Peter. How are
We
you?
have a distinguished guest in studio.
I'm not sure I'm distinguished.
Well,
I'm a guest.
But you're not extinguished.
That's true. Not yet.
Distinguished is good. I'm more closer to extinguished than you are.
Okay, well, I'm getting there, though.
I am happy to slow down and wait for you. Though.
Okay, all right.
So and now this is Lee Banville, and you are a professor at the J. They like to call it the J School.
J
right?
School. That makes us sound cooler than we actually are.
I
The
guess
journalism school of the University of Montana.
Okay.
It sounds like a truck stop with the J.
The Flying J.
Flying
School.
J School. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe. I mean, we could try that as a marketing campaign, you know?
So before we get too far into things, just tell us a little bit about the J School itself. What you guys, the art you practice, and how good you are.
Oh, how good we are.
Yeah.
Well, I'll
just
start
go
with
all
that.
Trump on this.
Right. It's tremendous. It's a tremendous school.
Is it a huge school?
It's a huge school.
And if Dr. Abrams is listening, it's a fantastic school.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, the journalism school has been around for a long time. We're actually one of the oldest journalism schools in the country, which is kind of funny to think about. We started in 1914 in a bunch of Army tents on the Oval. And so for the past 100 years, we've been teaching sort of the core skills of, gathering the news. I mean, the stuff you guys do every day, the gathering the news, synthesizing all this information and sort of presenting it in a way that can be compelling and interesting. What I like about the school is we're really focused on, we don't talk about journalism. I mean, we do a little bit, but we really do it. I mean, we teach by doing. And so, for example, I'm teaching a class that's covering elections. And so we've written stories that have gone. Oh, boy. Yeah. Yeah. Mainly local elections, which make it a little less circus-like and a little bit more, what we were doing was writing stories about all the statewide races for weekly newspapers all over the state. And so, those stories ran in papers from Sydney to Bozeman to Glendive. That's not that far. I should go further west.
Now, circuses haven't been a feature of any of our statewide candidates, but live Beatles shows have.
Yeah.
We're getting closer.
I mean, and we got 2 weeks. Who knows where we could end up? I mean,
actually, circuses are banned here in Missoula, so I don't know if we're going to quite get there. Well, at least elephants in circus.
Yeah, right. No large animals.
Which is bad news for Republicans. But donkeys
are more than welcome. Yeah, so the journalism school, though, I mean, basically, one of the things that's pretty remarkable is we're a small school. We only have 12 full-time professors, but this last week we actually found out that, we took all our student work and all the student work from other journalism schools around the country and submitted it to this contest called the Hearst Awards. And we ranked, once they totaled up how everybody did in all these competitions, we were the 7th best journalism school in the country. And
very good.
For a school in western Montana with 12 faculty, that's not too shabby.
That's pretty good.
So I wanted to ask you a question about the necessity of journalism and the type of degree you offer. And I'm saying this as a guy who, Peter and I, neither of us have journalism degrees and do quote-unquote journalism, the activity, on a regular daily basis.
I don't even think you have to quote it. Actually, you're doing journalism on a daily basis.
It's on the radio, so only you saw it.
Oh, okay.
The question I guess I have is what sort of stuff are students getting out of the journalism school that they wouldn't get in the field?
Well, actually, I mean, not a lot. I mean, what it is it's giving them the experience before they hit the field, right? So, I actually didn't go to a journalism school either. I learned journalism by doing it. And part of me wishes I would have learned a little bit more before I started doing it for a paycheck. And so I think what we really focus on is, it is part of a liberal arts education, so it's about learning about everything and then also really focusing on the skills of writing. It's stuff that you do build up while you're doing it in the field, but our hope is by training them early on when they first hit the field, they're better prepared to really contribute to the communities they're going to report about from day one rather than learning and 6 months later being kind of getting better at this.
Well, some of the gaps I've noticed in my own career, things I just have big blind spots on because I never got any training, or how would I get information from a governmental agency when I don't have any insiders? Right. When I have people on the inside that will trust me and give me information, it's a lot easier. But I did a story, it was about 2.5 years ago, on the mayor and his salary over time. I went to the city hall and I got information. And I got hammered by City Hall, specifically the mayor and his personal chief of staff, Jenny Merriam. And
Who is a J School grad?
Who, by the way, called me up, talked to me for like 2 hours. So mad at me for doing this story. Off of information I got from them.
Which is public information.
It's public information.
Right. Sure.
And then after that, she said that all that information is wrong. You need to have this information. They sent me totally different numbers, and like, I was just like overwhelmed. I mean, I felt bad, and I felt like I did the right thing at the same time, and I didn't know what to do.
Well,
it's so confusing.
So I think that is one of the things that actually we do offer is, I mean, so we do a lot of training in legal issues and access to public information and what are your rights, because what you did was completely allowable by any citizen in Montana. And so, but also understanding that sometimes you have to verify those numbers with the office, because the number that the clerk might hand you might not be the right number because they just pulled the wrong file, right? It might, oftentimes that verification and that sort of following up in different directions is sort of the thing that we help students really master before they start, before they step on any landmines. Or if they're going to step on the landmine, they do it on purpose rather than, inadvertently.
Sure.
Well, strap on those headphones.
Okay.
Because we do have a caller right away. So
right away.
Let's get Mark on the line. Mark, thanks for holding. You're on Talkback with Professor Banville. Hi.
Hello.
What's up?
I just got a quick question. Since it surprised me, I'm not from Montana, but having, one of the earliest, journalism schools. So how much did the school and its students, they probably stayed in the state of Montana, have on getting Jeanette Rankin as the first woman elected to Congress?
Well, when we look back at the reporting, so that was happening right around the same time the school was starting up.
Thanks, Mark.
And so, that is a really good question because, basically, Montana plays this sort of unique role. We have one of the earliest journalism schools. We have the first female representative of Congress, and they are all around the same time. I don't think there was a lot of direct connection between the role of those early students and the election of Rankin.
But I'm sure they reported on it.
They probably did, but actually, off the top of my head, I don't know exactly. The school had just started when she was elected, and so I think there's a good chance that actually they were still in school when she was running. And so I'm not sure what degree they would have done a ton of reporting on it, but it did sort of mark, this sort of unique moment at like the 1914 to 1918 sort of period where Montana was really kind of carving out a niche for itself that was pretty historic.
Well, it would have been cool to have them hooked up on Facebook, though, in 1914.
I'm sure they were friends. I'm sure they, they liked that.
But seriously speaking, though, to have the first female member of Congress from Montana, I think that would have perked the ears up of any journalist in Montana, thinking, I got to get in touch with this lady, even if it's just by mail or telegraph or whatever, back in that time, just to keep in touch, correspond with the things that she was doing to keep her constituents here in Montana informed.
Right, and actually, so Dean Stone, who founded the school, saw that need within communities throughout Montana to actually start supplying professional journalism to ensure that, everything from, the Rankin campaign to, the work of the Anaconda Copper Company was going to be covered for the people of Montana. It was very kind of it was a progressive time, and it was a progressive sort of mindset that elected Rankin, but also said, what we need is better trained journalists to go and tell communities what's going on in their government and in their society.
Okay, we're going to take a break. We have 4 lines open at 721-1290. Professor Lee Banville joining us from the University of Montana School of Journalism. And they're talking about politics in their classes, so we're going to come right back with more in a moment. Okay, we're back on Talkback, 721-1290, 1-800-568-5309. Professor Lee Banville, joining us from the University of Montana School of Journalism. So,
and just to give us a little bit of background on yourself.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your background in journalism. You said briefly, I think the only thing I know about you so far is that you didn't go to journalism school.
That's a great sales pitch for the journalism school, isn't it? You, too, can be a journalism professor without going to the journalism school. Yeah, no, so I'm also one of those East Coasters who are ruining Montana. So,
Where are you from, really?
I grew up in Pennsylvania, so
Cool.
sort of central Pennsylvania, and then I went to college in Virginia, and I worked in D.C. for 15 years.
Lee Banville wants to change stream access law.
Yeah, it's
A millionaire non-journalism professor.
Pennsylvania billionaire. Yeah, no, a Pennsylvania thousandaire.
Yeah, there you go.
My wife and I always vacationed out here, and so we were like, if we could ever come up with a way to live out here. I mean, we talked about retiring out here, but then we'd be old. And so we saw the journalism school on a trip out west, and was like, wow, that may be the one thing we could actually do out here that maybe could make it work. And that year they posted for a position, and I applied, and in 2009 we moved out here, and so we've been out here since. And it's working for Jim Lehrer, who was the nightly PBS NewsHour, was a great experience. I mean, he's a very balanced, sort of very measured journalist, and so I learned a lot from him in that. And
Were you primarily broadcast or print?
I was doing mainly sort of digital and internet stuff. So I helped them start an internet site in 1995, and we were doing podcasts. And
Them being PBS or
Yeah.
Jim Lehrer?
Jim Lehrer specifically. So I worked for the McNeil Lehrer Productions program that actually produced the NewsHour. So, I mean, although obviously nobody knows there's a difference between PBS and NPR and the NewsHour, it was a sort of separate company. And it was there, I really I could have still been there, but it was just this opportunity to kind of change lifestyle and not live and breathe news 24 hours a day and, have tsunamis ruin your Christmas. Well, I mean, they're also incredibly important stories. I mean, as a journalist, you're always kind of morbid like that, where you're like, oh, that's going to ruin my holiday. And, oh, yeah, hundreds of thousands of people have died. But it's, it was a decision to kind of, change things. And then what was nice was the journalism school allowed me to kind of, it didn't become an academic exercise. It was more like I'd always been an editor. And so now I was serving as an editor to, 20-year-olds versus 25-year-olds.
So it's one thing that I've noticed kind of interesting when it comes to radio news versus public radio news is that the expectations are a little bit different. The pay is quite a bit different.
Right.
I mean, when you look at what Peter makes compared to what the local guy for public radio makes, we're talking the difference of nearly 6 figures.
Right.
I mean, it's a huge gap. And when you talk about the amount of work that goes into the news, there's also a huge gap, not in Peter's favor. I mean, I've listened to the news that's read on public radio, and it's usually just AP copy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a couple samples where you go and you listen to an interview that someone might do, a longer form interview.
Right.
But like for
they're
our
doing
morning
a fair
noise,
amount of tape out of. So they have a reporter in Helena, and they have a reporter, a halftime reporter in the Flathead, and they're doing longer pieces that are 4 or 5 minutes. But yes, I mean, there's a lot of the news breaks are very similar to the news breaks here.
right? But I guess the difference in tenor, it seems to me, is that so much seems to be national content, reliance on outside sources, not in Montana, for example. I don't know. It just seems like a different. And when you go to the media like ours, I'm not saying like media and radio journalism in the private sector is all that awesome either. I mean, very low wages, it seems to me, across the board. Very low oversight, cuts in every corner you can make.
Right.
Responsibilities out the wazoo. I mean, day one, you get hired here, you're responsible for knowing how to do everything online, on air. My training for doing the on-air side of this job was about a week or two on that board, and then it was all live, and the training was live too.
Right.
The digital stuff happened day one.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
yeah, the digital stuff.
And so all of a sudden you're immediately responsible. And we were talking off air about some stories that ended up ruining people's lives, people committing suicide because of the results of some negatives here locally in town. And you think that's a lot of responsibility to put on somebody. And but it happens every day in America.
Well, and I think, I mean, one of the things to always keep in mind is, I mean, you're right. I mean, we are, we are trying to explain society in the middle of society while society is happening, right? And so it's a live, ongoing sort of conversation that journalists have with their communities and with their listeners and readers. And so it's really important to recognize that we oftentimes, because of that that process, we don't always get it right the first time. So there is an element of, I think we try to sort of imbue in journalists that they have to sort of be aware of the impact their reporting has, the community that they're trying to serve, and be respectful of that. That it's not just, but also, being respectful of that is oftentimes also showing them things they don't want to see, right, and things they don't want to talk about, and that can be challenging for somebody who wants to help the community, but also needs to challenge it when it's doing something wrong.
Lee, how much of true journalism, from the art form, how much of it is simply who, what, telling the facts, who, what, when, where, how, as opposed to becoming almost an advocate for a position? You see what I mean? For instance, I watched the movie Spotlight the other day, and what they did at the Boston Globe with the scandal in the Roman Catholic Church. And it was very compelling. Mm-hmm. And you look at what happened in Watergate, also very compelling. But those are very high points in a universe that kind of is, down here, and then you have peaks that go way up.
Right.
So very, very seldom does a newspaper or a television station or a radio station have the opportunity to, be, that compelling.
Mm-hmm.
We're basically just kind of keeping people informed day to day. So what's the ratio there?
I don't know. I mean, it's different per news organization. Like some news organizations have the capacity to do more investigative, more long form stuff. And to your point about Montana Public Radio, I mean, they have some resources that allow them to do longer stories out of places that are further from here. And so they use those resources in a way that you guys would love to have, right? Because I mean, you're busy telling us, what the weather is today, what the new, what the clerk of the court was telling, or the county clerk was telling us about how the ballots are being handled in Missoula County. Very immediate, very local. And so I think it varies from news organization to news organization. I do think what we've seen is there are more and more people contributing to the full body of what people call the media, and that word always makes me a little like, but the media, there are advocates in the media. I think one of the most important roles that journalists are increasingly playing, because lots of people see things and put it on social media and be like, there's a car fire here, there's a house fire here. That interpretive layer of like, well, what does it mean? Is it a big deal? What's the impact of it? Isn't advocacy, but is an incredibly important sort of layer of journalism that I think we need to ensure is still there.
Okay, we're up against a break. 721-1290. Catherine's on the line. We'll get to you in a moment. And we have 3 other lines open and a whole nother hour after that. So we're going to be right back with more with Professor Lee Banville in just a moment. And we went a little bit long in the last segment, so let's go right to the phones. Catherine, you have a question for Lee Banville. Hi.
Yes, it's sort of a complex question with several parts here.
Go ahead.
Big surprise.
All right, I'm ready.
Okay. Reporters Without Borders recently issued its latest global ranking 2016 of press freedom. The United States is ranked 41st behind Namibia and Belize.
Ooh.
So what do you think of that? Do you agree or disagree? And what do you think the recent proposed media mergers, AT&T, Time Warner, Verizon, etc., will do for press freedom and free speech? Do you think it will increase or decrease? And also, how about the release of ICANN from U.S. control to an international committee that includes countries that do not subscribe to a free flow of information and opinions?
Those are several
large
issues. No, that's true. So, but there are really 3 critical issues I sort of picked up on. Let's talk about press freedom specifically.
We have 1 minute, and we'll continue.
And then I will come back and talk about it. So press freedom, Catherine, I do think is one of the, the United States has some of the strongest press freedom laws in the world, and yet at the same time, there are pressures on those press freedoms that are oftentimes really complex. There are economic pressures that she mentions about the Time Warner AT&T merger. News is now expected to be a profit center. It's not just a public service that justifies your FCC license, right? It's a thing that makes money. And so it's really important to understand that those pressures affect not so much the legal freedom of journalists, but the economic sort of capacity journalists have to actually do the work.
And we're going to hang on to that. So you've written down the questions. We're going to continue answering them after the top of the hour. Emmett and Pete are both on the line, and 2 other lines open. We'll be back after the top of the hour. Okay, we're back. This is hour number 2 of Talk Back, and Professor Lee Banville joining us from the University of Montana School of Journalism. Catherine asked several questions at once. We got through almost one of them.
Right.
So if you would please continue.
Sure. So, I mean, she raised the issue of how we compare to other countries. And it is true that actually there have been some erosion of press freedoms in the United States as, I mean, it's important to understand that most press freedoms are driven by court case decisions, and court case decisions are not made in a vacuum. And so if the role of the media is seen as valuable and contributing to, keeping a watchdog on what the government's up to, then courts oftentimes view press cases more favorably, right, than they do if it's seen as an intrusive, negative force in the community. Sometimes, journalists become the targets of law enforcement or courts. And so I think as those have changed over time, as the opinion of media has changed over time, I think that some of those press freedoms have been curtailed a bit.
What have we lost? I mean, are we talking about the Hulk Hogan sex tape? Is that the epitome of what lost journalism integrity or what?
Well, I mean, I think so. The Gawker story is important in a couple ways because what it did was it set a boundary on what were oftentimes seen as important press freedoms that were established in the 1960s under the Sullivan v. New York Times case, where it basically created this view that to be punished, journalists had to deliberately lie. And that sounds like an incredibly broad protection because it is.
That'd be malice, right?
Right, actual malice.
And proving intent's incredibly hard to do. So
incredibly, you have to be able to demonstrate that they knew that they were publishing inaccurate information and they did it on purpose to hurt a person, which is a really hard bar to hit. But the reason that was established was because local courts were going after the New York Times to stop them from reporting on civil rights. And so it wasn't, this wasn't a vacuum. This wasn't just a decision about journalists being great. It was, we need to be able to hear about things that are going on all over the country for us to be able to work as a democracy. And so now, I mean, the Hulk Hogan tape is not the case that we as journalists would want to be like, that's what we need to worry about. But when that happens, the next case that comes down the pike might not be quite so salacious and not quite so, but still the precedent is now there to sort of limit those sort of operational freedoms we had before.
All right. Well, she also asked a question you haven't addressed about ICANN, which
yes.
ICANN is not just a presidential slogan.
Right.
It's also the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. I had to look that one up because I didn't remember it off the top of my head. But
no, it just trips off the tongue.
Yeah, but this is basically the people that make the .coms, the .orgs, the .govs.
Right. They're the ones who control, who kind of regulate how the internet is organized and what it's called and how you find it. And it was because of a bit of a fluke of history. It was an American creation, right? It was created.
And what's wrong with that?
Well, we'll make
it
the internet great again.
Blood of eagles.
And, yes,
American.
The internet ain't free.
Sprung fully formed from Abe Lincoln's hat.
Okay, we're letting.
All right. So ICANN was an American creation, and it also established that the internet would be a commercial platform, right? That you would sell and buy stuff on the internet, and so, there was always this question of, well, if it is the International Convention of Naming and Number, why is it American? And for a long time, nobody really kind of questioned it, mainly because it was just, well, it worked and we don't really care. But there is an element of, if it is really truly an inter-nation sort of communication system.
That's why they call it the World Wide Web.
It is the World Wide Web, not the, America Web. That's why it should be governed in a way that is international. And I mean, the point she raises that, many of the countries that are going to be involved now don't view the information the way we do, that, it's primarily should be free and available to people. That is not the way everybody thinks about it, but that is not the way everybody thinks about it. And so the Americanization of ICANN has not helped Chinese people have access to information that the Chinese government doesn't want them to have, right? It hasn't curtailed those freedoms. Will it affect ours? That's many steps down a road, but I mean, it could change the dynamic as we're having those conversations.
Were you surprised that went through with so little fanfare?
No, because it's sort of like
because that's the platform we all use.
Well, it's sort of, I mean, so, when broadcasting began, when television began, there was a standard, the NTSC standard, that was an American standard, and there's a European standard, and it was the PAL standard, and they didn't match. So you could buy a TV in America and it wouldn't work in Europe, and vice versa. So, and nobody knows what I'm talking about right now because standards are boring, and so you just expect them to work, even though it's an incredibly important shift. It's so sort of embedded in the system that we just assume works that I think most people don't understand the significance of it.
It's like metric and measurements, right? You're just used to it.
Okay, Emmett and Pete, we're going to get you guys on. We're up against a break here, and I want to give you both plenty of time to make your points, so we'll take a quick time out. Professor Lee Banville joining us here in the studio. 721-1290 is our number. We have 2 lines open. We haven't even started talking about media bias yet. So
What?
What?
Doesn't exist. Story over.
We'll be right back. Stay with us. Okay, we're moving and grooving. Here we go. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. Okay, Professor Lee Banville, University of Montana School of Journalism. Ready for some calls?
I am.
Let's do it. All right, let's jump in here. Emmett, you're up first. Hi.
Oh, thanks for taking my call. Well, I do want to talk about media bias. As someone who has followed the news regularly since 1986, since I got on my own, I really can absolutely see the media bias. I mean, just from a recent example, CNN has already projected Hillary Clinton as the winner when the election hasn't even begun. I mean, it's begun, but the election day isn't here. We don't know. They've coronated her, and it's all about how terrible Trump is, but how Hillary is wonderful for women. Then on ABC, you always hear stories about gay equality, women's equality, women's reproductive health, and how to save the world from the people that don't believe in climate change. And it's such a media bias. It's like, I think objective journalism should just be, here's what, like, let's say, we don't know who's going to win the election, but here are a couple of people who like Trump and like Hillary. Now let's talk about North Korea. There's a storm out, perhaps, in Kentucky. End of the news story, rather than this media bias from the 60s, because they were graduates from the 60s that decided to change the world once they got out of college in the 60s. What does the professor think of this?
All right. Thanks, Emmett. So what do you think?
By the way, are either of you from the 60s? Just
I graduated in 1995.
look at this guy. He can't possibly be biased. He's from 1995.
That's right.
Peter, however, I'm curious about.
He doesn't have to comment on that. So, I mean, the question of bias is one that I think journalists have to face all the time because there are inherent biases in the way we do our jobs. I don't think they're the biases most people think they are. So the biases that worry me are less the corporate overlords telling us to implement conservative pro-business policies, or I think, as Emmett was implying, that many journalists are liberal. They tend to be more democratic, much more democratic than Republican. But I don't know to the degree that turns into, I want the Democrats to win. I think that what we do see very clearly is, like, journalists tend to have a bias towards the people who call them back. So when you're a journalist, I mean, you have to think of journalism as a profession. And when journalists want to tell a story, basically it starts by going and interviewing people and calling people and talking to people, because we tend to seek out sources. And those sources have enormous sway over the way we tell that story. The first person who calls us back, we ask all our questions to.
John and I are giggling.
We are laughing. A year and a half ago, I would have told you Steve Bullock was a really nice guy.
Uh-huh.
I had one interview with him face to face. When he started running for the governorship again, really hard, right? I haven't been able to get an interview throughout the entire gubernatorial election with an audience of 26,000 people. Mm-hmm. And it has totally skewed my opinion of him as not someone that's inaccessible,
right?
As someone that's not forward with. And even if maybe he's just honestly busy every time I call. But I get this kind of, I can feel it, a little growing seed of bias against this guy now because of that behavior.
but it's not particularly a political bias, right? It's a why won't you talk to me? And sometimes it's, well, the staff has decided that you're not important enough to get through to talk to them. It's those biases are really hard to fight because you start to be like, you're just a jerk.
It's like a personal thing.
Right.
Yeah.
It's or you're like, well, I already talked to, Greg Gianforte and he told me X, Y, and Z. And so I'm going to now just turn around and ask, you to respond to that. But that's still being dictated by that first person who answered. And so those are biases that I think we really have to watch out for because our sources drive enormously how we actually end up reporting stories.
I want to back up Emmett's point here of the idea that the news media is biased. I think it's a harder thing to say now than it was in the past because of all the diverse media out there. It's becoming less and less. And for example, if you're like Emmett, maybe you'll go and watch Alex Jones or some alternative media than the traditional line, and you're not locked in anymore, really.
Right.
However, I saw, so Politico did an interview of the 72 members of the White House press corps in April of this year. Mm-hmm. When they did that interview, do you remember how many of them said that they were Republicans?
I think it was 2.
It was 0.
Oh, was it?
It was 0.
Okay.
More than a quarter said they were Democrats.
Right.
78% thought it was important for journalists to vote. So you have this kind of, and this is when a Democratic administration is in charge. You'd think you'd have some opposition maybe in the press corps to be there to ask some questions and push and challenge in alternative ways. I'm not saying it doesn't happen.
I was going to say, but does that White House press corps always think that Obama's right?
Probably not.
Probably not.
But yes, a lot of the times.
Well...
Now, let me ask my second point.
Okay.
Right? Okay, so the Center for Public Integrity did a study on all of the,
money.
This one, the money.
Yeah, the money. Yep.
And the results on this. So 96% of money that came from journalists or journalist associations went to Democrats.
Correct.
Now you're indebted. You're tied financially to these candidates succeeding. You don't think that plays some role?
So I think that the CPI study I think is interesting because basically, first of all, it takes, I think definitions are really important. Okay. Right. So like you can say that somebody is a journalist in the media, and many of the people that they sourced were food critics, right? Or were film critics, or were people who worked in the sales departments of journalism organizations. I'm not saying there aren't problems there, but oftentimes this sort of sweep of like journalists are out there and we're like, secret agents of the Democratic Party. It becomes a way to dismiss the information that certain audiences don't want to hear. Because it's like, oh, well, it's just the liberal media telling me that, Donald Trump's done something wrong or that, Hillary Clinton has done something right. And my worry is it turns into facts become debatable, right? That you can say, Donald Trump said, there were thousands of Muslims celebrating on the rooftops of Jersey City. And journalists say, no, there weren't. And people are like, yeah, well, you're just Democrats trying to convince us that he's wrong. And I'm like, no, but they weren't. You know what I mean? It's really important to be like, I understand. I respect the concerns about bias, but I think when they get to the point where you dismiss facts because you think there's a perceived bias by the journalists, that's where
that's just your bias trumping somebody else.
Correct.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right on that. There is a danger in saying they're biased, so I can't believe anything that they say. Right. On the flip side, I think it's a really hard. I think journalists have a really tough point to prove to the American people that they are not biased at this point. I mean, and those.
But how would you prove it? I mean, how would you?
Let's look at Missoula, Montana media.
Okay.
So, for example, in the last year, we've done a story on Governor Bullock, and it took me a lot of work to get this story. It includes photographic evidence of him flying here to Missoula for a concert and flying out of town. All he did is appear at the concert. He talked to one of his friends that he went to high school with who happened to be in business. Mm-hmm. And he justified the whole trip by saying we spoke with business people. It was a state development meeting, and that was good. The story, the only piece that was ran after I did that story was out of, I think, the Billings Gazette. And the only title that they give it is, in the first sentence, some right-wing media says da-da-da-da-da-da. And here's the facts, according to Governor Bullock. They only spoke with Governor Bullock, of course. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of get this one-sided echo chamber in Montana, at least, it seems to me, of bias. And I don't even necessarily believe that it's political bias, but it's power bias. Because if you lose the access to the governor as a media journalist, then you're going to have a really hard time writing stories for the next 4 years. If you lose your access to the mayor, which I have, you're going to have a hard time writing stories about the mayor for the next 4 years.
Well, and there's no First Amendment guarantee that they have to talk to you, right? You can't make them talk.
Exactly. We're up against a break. So that's one thing I have to do. So we have, you are now officially reached rock star status, Lee.
I know. I see the board is lit
all four
up.
lines are lit up. We have Pete, Dave, John, and Mike, and they all want to visit with you, and we'll be right back. Hey, we're back. This is Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. Professor Lee Banville joining us here in studio. Let's jump right into the phones and get rocking here. Pete, thank you for holding. You're on with Professor Banville. Go ahead.
Just a brief comment and then on to my question.
Okay.
I really enjoy your program. But when you have people in the queue, I've been in 29 minutes and 32 seconds.
Sorry about that.
And when we're in the queue and you see that it's flashing, I think it'd be nice if you and John there don't get into a sidelight discussion until you're trying to fill time because it's a call-in program.
Well, it's not just a call-in program, Pete. It's a program where we're trying to get information and let folks know what's going on. Sometimes John has a question. Sometimes I do. I try to keep the mix flowing, but sometimes it does bottle up, and I apologize.
My bad, Pete.
No, and I probably am talking too much too. Sorry.
No, you aren't. Okay, but my observation and question to the professor.
Okay. Go ahead.
I go back to being able to have seen real broadcast journalism in the days of Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, who reported the news, fair and objective for the day, did not have any sidelight reinterpretation for those of us who are too stupid to understand what they're saying. And I'm wondering, on fair and balanced news coverage, how as a professor you help put that into your students so they understand that and really appreciate it and try to protect it when they go out into professional life and not try to have all the authority with none of the responsibility.
Okay. Thanks, Pete. Appreciate the call. So what do you think?
Well, I mean,
That's
a
very good question.
It's a really good question. So, I mean, I think it's partially. So, I mean, yeah, that is one of the core things we try to really teach these kids is that they have a responsibility to the people who are going to read and consume their content to try and explain things as clearly and concisely and effectively as possible, because people are going to be making decisions about who they're going to vote for. They're going to be making decisions about who they're, what businesses they're going to go to. It's going to affect their lives. And so journalists, whether they're, 18 or they're, 57, need to recognize the impact that their reporting has. I think the one thing I would say is one of the things that has changed is the business model of media, right? That when Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley were on, there were 4 channels, and so you had to appeal to everyone, right? That's your economic model. You needed to appeal to the most liberal and the most conservative and the huge body politic in between. And now there's an economic model that really strives to push people towards core audiences that might be more partisan, right? So the
Fox News
Fox
does
News,
this,
MSNBC does that.
They've identified their audiences and are playing to them. Now, is that wrong?
It's not wrong, but it makes the voices that Pete's talking about, the Cronkites and the Huntley Brinkleys, harder to because they're not as marketable, right? They're measured, thoughtful, balanced, and that. Yeah, I mean, I worked in PBS for 15 years. And I know those voices, and I respect those voices. But it's a niche audience too now.
Okay, let's get Dave on. Dave, thanks for holding. You're on. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I was watching Fox News the other day, and there was a reporter on there who said she worked for Fox and went to Trump rallies, and she felt when she was going into the rally that her life was in danger, that the Trump people, the fans were really against all the media. And it appears as though it's almost like it's the press, the rallies Trump and he builds people up to just actually are enemies, that the press is the enemies of Trump. And I'm not sure how you're going to deal with that, and if, what the people want from the press.
It's surprising that a Fox reporter would say that, because the intimation would be that Fox would be more pro-Trump. At least that's the impression. That's the image.
Right, but I guess the press were kept in a separate zone area.
Okay.
And so the Trump people said, the press are all bad, and just locked up the Fox people with everyone else.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
I think it's important you remember that Trump has had some pretty famous battles with Megyn Kelly, George Will, Charles Krauthammer even.
Right.
I mean, he's offended pretty much every American.
Well, and I think that this making the media part of the story is a trend that we've seen in politics for multiple election cycles, right? People are very quick to sort of say the reason why my guy is losing or my woman is winning or my candidate didn't get a fair shake was because the media. And so many candidates have seen a really effective way to play to that is to accentuate that. So we have seen, especially in the last couple of weeks, the Trump campaign really focused on the fact that this is in fact not the Democrats versus the Republicans, but it's actually the Democrats and their toadies in the media seeking to really disenfranchise all these Trump voters. And I think it's a message that plays really well. And I think it's worrisome because it again leads to this question of, can anybody provide information about a Trump rally without it being seen as a part of the political campaign itself? Like, can you report on it without being turned into a part of the argument?
A human being has to attend, has to observe, has to write the story. So it's not as though some computer just takes this fact and throws them together and presents it. I mean, it has to be from a human perspective. And that human is going to have their own thoughts and feelings about things. So how do you avoid that?
Well, I mean, for me as a journalist, it's always come down to I don't really know better than anyone else. Like, I don't secretly have some fountain of knowledge that makes me magically superior to my reader or my viewer. And so if I assume that they're as smart and as intelligent and as capable as I am, then I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to dictate what they should believe about something. I'm going to try to explain it as clearly as I can, and they're going to come to their own conclusion. That's what I think good journalism does. But it also has to have the strength to say, like, when somebody is saying something that's wrong, to call them out on it and to be trusted.
Okay. So you said you had a Facebook?
Oh, we did. It's from Brian. He says, what about the blatant editorial control? Does the professor think the collusion between the media and the DNC/Hillary campaign lay bare those biases?
Okay, we're going to come back and answer that when we come back from the break. Sorry. John, Catherine, Craig, and Mike, and Facebook, and everybody. We'll be right back.
Thank you.
Got my Bee Gees thing going this morning.
Nice.
721-1290 is the number. 1-800-568-5309. That's where I am at the alphabet. See?
Okay, all right. I was like, but I'm still 1995 graduate.
All right, let's get back to the phones. And John, you've been waiting the longest. Thank you for your patience. Go ahead.
Oh, I thought Pete was, but yeah, I just wanted to get back to it. It doesn't seem like at least in ideally speaking, it doesn't sound like it should be that difficult of a task to view journalism or how to tell the story in an unbiased fashion from the perspective of the reader. And you've touched on it in a few spots, but essentially, if the person knows nothing about the subject, then they don't have a bias about it. And so you should be, as a journalist, it seems like, looking for the truth, like investigative journalists, to merely inquire about the facts, not to control a narrative. And I think that my only run-in with the journalism department at the university was in a opening class for speaking, and the textbook was full of Hillary and Obama photos. So I thought that the whole class was biased just because of that.
Well, hey, thanks for your call, John.
Yes.
Appreciate it, man.
So there's a couple things in there. I mean, first of all, the idea that we should start with the assumption that the reader or the news consumer knows nothing about the subject is actually a really good spot to start. That you should just assume. I mean, but when we talk about controlling the narrative, it gets tricky, right? Because basically, if you start with the idea that they don't know anything, you first of all have to convince them that they need to want to know, right? That you need to tell them a story that actually draws them in and shows them why X issue, which might sound very, very disassociated with your life. So if you're not someone who's on the poorer end of the economic scale, why do you care about Medicaid expansion? That's a really hard thing to just conceptually think about and be like, oh, well, I care about it because of X. And so I think what's really important is journalists have to tell stories that actually connect people to those issues. And it's always important that if you just gather facts and I present you with a PowerPoint presentation of facts, you will, many people, not everyone, I mean, I don't want to say that John will, I mean, but many people will totally tune that out because it's going to be boring. Sure. It's going to be like going to the city council and just sitting there and listening to every city council meeting. You need to tell them the story that actually draws them in. And that is a narrative that actually a journalist really needs to construct. And it's really important they do a good job to do it.
Well, and beyond that, there is a question of, editorial control about which stories to pursue, right? Mm-hmm. How hard do you take the story of Billy Bush talking with Donald Trump on the van? Are we going to, in 2 days, play this more than any of the Jennifer Flowers accusations we've had for the last 10 years? Yes, we will. Right? I mean,
But we also have probably 4 times the amount of media that we had then in 1992.
Fair
right?
enough. Absolutely true. Yeah, we have way more media, but you're going to get more airtime for certain stories than other stories. And,
sure.
And frankly, a lot of it's because some stories are a lot easier to report. It's easier to tell a story of Trump saying something horrible.
Not only that,
than it is to explain to people why the emails are an issue.
But a producer will say, I'm on the hook for ratings. This is going to give us ratings. We're leading with it. Even though we led with it the last 3 nights, we're going to keep leading with it until the focus groups tell us they're tired of it. And I know that may not be the journalist's point of view, but from the producer's point of view, especially on television, they're saying, we got to get those ratings up. This is how we do it. And that may sound mean and nasty, but that's, if you will, quote, the way of the world, unquote.
Well, and I mean, it is true. I mean, there's this inherent tension, and it's been here since the founding of the Republic, that essentially journalists are supposed to help create an informed electorate on the one hand,
right,
and be a business. And they don't always go well together because the business of media has
very
become
odd bedfellows,
become niche, and so you can have an audience that's really, a politically polarized audience. You can have an audience that's really built around, I'm really into whatever sort of cigars, and you can have magazines that are cigar based. I mean, the media becomes sort of niche, and it becomes hard to sort of be that voice that's going to communicate with everyone.
Okay, Catherine, Craig, Mike, and Walt, stand by. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back. 721-1290 is our number, and you had a question from one of his former students, right?
We do.
This isn't going to be good.
This is a question from Sarah. Sarah wants to know what you thought of Krakauer's journalistic work. This is something that has very much impacted the journalism department at the University of Montana after it hit bookstands last,
sure,
or
yeah.
2 years ago, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's well, I mean, I think so. I think it depends on what you want from the book. I think if you want to understand, I think it was a very compelling story of what it is like to be the victim of sexual assault in our system, and the challenges that those victims face, both from authorities and from sometimes the media. And I think that story was really compellingly told. He interviewed lots of the victims. He told their story. When you get to the other side of the equation, which is why does the system act that way, I think it became a document-driven sort of sterile narrative that didn't really explain why someone makes a decision, right? Because that's not going to come out in, the complexity of prosecuting a sexual assault case is really difficult for prosecutors to tackle. And so I think
it's the hardest one, in fact.
And I think that not talking to them, not giving them a chance to air their side of the story, I think was was not good. I think that it left the story unfinished. And so if we're trying to understand what was wrong with the system or how the system can be improved, we didn't get a lot from that book.
Okay. Catherine's already been on once, so I'm gonna go ahead and get Craig on first. Craig, thanks for holding. You're on. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. So, I can't believe that somebody could watch the morning news or the evening news and not come to some understanding that the press is so liberally biased, it's ridiculous. And I just think these people are in denial, and maybe you've heard that's not a river in Egypt.
But can I ask you, what specific programs do you think? I'm not saying that they're not. I'm just kind of like getting more specific because the media is a big, messy thing.
Oh, yes, it is. Well, I'll watch one program for a while, and then I finally get disgusted, and then I go on to another.
Can you name which ones you're watching? That's what he's asking.
23 is what, ABC?
Yeah, ABC Fox.
So Good Morning America?
Pardon, sir?
Good Morning America?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That group, they're so doggone biased, it's ridiculous. But anyways,
Thanks for your call.
I think so anyways, and I don't see how you're a professor from the university. I think the university is just, all the universities are liberal anyway, so you wouldn't think that way.
Yeah, probably a double whammy.
Thanks, Craig. So when you look at programs like Good Morning America, Today Show, things like that, when you watch them, the impression that you get is, wow, these guys are in the tank for Hillary, big time. So
I think it's God, I really don't want to have to defend every
probably
media
because
there,
it's an entertainment program. It's not a news program.
It falls under the news division, but it is very much built around it. So they recognize who is their audience. And who is the audience of most morning programs? Well, it's usually not Craig, honestly. It's
probably women.
It's overwhelmingly women. And so, not that so there's a phenomenon called audience bias, right? Which is you basically reflect the bias of your audience. And it's still bias, but it's a bias driven by the people who consume your news. And it's one we have to guard against, but it's one that economically there's enormous pressure on us to respond to.
But it's real.
It's real, sure.
All right, let's get Walt on. Walt, thanks for holding. Go ahead, sir.
Good morning.
Hi.
Morning.
What's up, man?
Hey, a couple of questions first, and I'll be quick. I'm in the CPA accounting business, and objectivity is the hallmark of our profession. And I thought objectivity was the hallmark of the journalism profession. And I don't see much objectivity out there in the journalism world these days. Do you?
Well, I do see some. I see some that's not. I think the danger. So my argument would be if the places you're turning aren't treating, and I think objectivity is a really interesting and a really good way to talk about it, because it's essentially applying almost the scientific method to a story. Because you as a journalist are going to have ideas, but if you actually go through the process of saying, I'm not going to just write the story now. I'm actually going to interview all these people, and I'm going to test those theories, and I'm going to reject my own theory if it's wrong. That can create really compelling stories, and I think it's being done out there. It's not being done by everyone. It's not being done always to the best degree it can. But if viewers and listeners respond to that objectivity and seek it out in a true form, not in a form that confirms what your bias is.
Now, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Could some of what these folks are seeing as bias simply be laziness on the report of the on the account of the reporter saying, this is what you told me, I'm taking it at face value, it must be true because you're a big time politician or whatever, so I'm reporting it just exactly the way you said it. Now that's kind of lazy, isn't it?
Well, it's it is a little bit lazy. Yeah, that's true.
Just a little.
I think our job is to not simply parrot what we're told. But also, I think, we need to recognize that the journalism business does not have the resource it used to have. And so, you as a journalist are expected to file that first series of tweets as soon as you interview the person. And so you literally are only going to parrot what they say because you haven't had time to do anything else. But the idea is that they should be pushed to then verify those facts, add different voices, find perspectives that are not being heard and bring those into the mix.
Walt, thanks for the call, man.
Yeah, thanks, Walt.
Appreciate it, sir. All right. Chuck is next. Chuck, you're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Yes, I mean, it's just so obvious the media is biased. There's nothing more thing than the annual report of how the country's doing with all kinds of misinformation being put out by a president. Bill Clinton bragging about his Monday night 1,000 media people phone call that was run by, I forget the guy's name, he's now on NBC or one of the stations. Chelsea Clinton getting a job being paid almost $1 million a year to be an intern. I mean, there's just so many examples of look where they hire their people from. They don't very often hire conservatives.
Well, let me ask you this. When you say the media, who are you talking about?
I'm talking about the whole ball of wax. You can be specific about what the media is at the University of Montana and what news is, but the public sitting back watching it calls it all news.
Okay.
Whether that's fair or not, they're seeing a huge bias, and that's why there's a response to this right now. 94 million people are unemployed in this country, and you almost never hear about it because that would look negative on Democrats and especially Hillary.
All right.
That is a selection to direct where the media is going.
Hey, Chuck, thanks for the call. Appreciate that. And we have to go 1 minute timeout. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, so there's this website, it's called All Sides, and they try to rank bias. And the goal is so that you look at what bias you're reading, what sort of media you're getting coverage from, and then you can shift and try to get the other side by reading different media from the other side. The thing that I find interesting, people say all media, right? And I think that's a misnomer because there's obviously right-wing and left-wing media. But when you talk about your major nightly news, your ABC, your CBS, your NBC, the three ones that you can easily get on your public access channels, all of those, according to the All Sides, are center-left. So the dominant news coverage, it seems to me, that most Americans get, if they watch your just regular programming, is going to tilt left.
Okay, we're going to come right back after this 1 minute timeout. And we are rapidly running out of time, and I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Lee. You've taken all these calls. You've answered them all. We appreciate that.
I'm trying.
Doing great. So let's get Eli on. Eli, you're on. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, sir. I appreciate your conversation here, but, my concern, and I'll just make a comment, is that, the media has been, and I speak mostly of cable, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, that's where I get most of my news, has really is destroying our democracy and our freedom of speech in so much as they do not represent any aspect of the truth. They're chasing the dollar so hard that they have created the presidency or the running of the presidency of the Trump candidacy. That in earlier times he never would have got off first base, but he got billions and billions and billions of dollars of free media from all these folks, and they put him in power just because they were chasing the ratings. What do you guys think about that?
Okay, thanks for the call.
Well, I think Eli does have a point about the amount of coverage that Trump received during the primaries was fairly staggering, and the
he didn't have to spend a dime.
He spent a record little amount of money for a modern presidential campaign because he has gotten enormous free media coverage from the news media.
And he's really taken over the internet.
I mean, that's he broke the internet. Yeah. And I think so what we see is, it's I think to his point about, cable news being driven by viewership, I mean, that is something to be concerned about. I mean, I think that, one of the benefits we have now is because the media world is so diverse and there are so many different sources of information. The challenge for me is to make sure that people want to go out and find it, that they don't passively consume news and say, well, it's biased, I'm going to reject it, or I don't like this version, so I'm going to ignore it. But actually, you have to actively go out and chase it, which is annoying as a consumer. I totally get that, but is really important because you need to mix the media you're consuming.
Real quick.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was hoping you could comment on the state of journalism in Montana and accessibility in Montana. I find it's very easy to get a hold of most of the political people in Montana. Right. Even our Congress people, except for John Tester. I've had a hard time getting a hold of him, but almost everybody. Daines is also harder than Zinke, but it seems the higher up, it's the harder to get a hold of.
Right.
But I guess there's a lot of questions about how Montana deals with information, right? So one of the things that came up recently was Bullock having all of his emails deleted, and that's the Republicans are kind of hammering him on trying to match him up with Hillary. Do you think those are fair accusations? And how should we as a state kind of try to address this for journalists in the future, no matter what party's in power?
Well, and I think, the thing that I think is always important to understand about media access laws is they aren't really about the media. They are really about the public, that the public has the right to get this stuff, and that we are really the annoying members of the public who choose to go and ask for it. But anyone could go and get these documents. That's the rule, right? The Montana Constitution has a right to know in it. And that's not a right for journalists to know, it's a right for everyone to know. And so I think Montana has really good laws on the books about access, but sometimes when it comes to, you pick up the phone and you call the governor's office, you call FWP, do they know how to apply their own rules to the information you're requesting? Sometimes it falls down. And I don't think it's always inherently they're hiding stuff. I think oftentimes they don't know what the rules are. They don't know how to apply them. And somebody calling and asking for stuff is scary. And so I think oftentimes I think we can do more. I think, equating the Hillary emails to the Bullock emails, I think it's a legitimate question to raise, but I think it also speaks to the fact that this is probably how they've run it forever, and they just never were doing it correctly. And, maybe they'll fix it now. But I think that's the question we have to ask.
Okay, we have like a minute. So, so Catherine, real quickly, what's your question?
Okay, this is related to my previous question. Foreign investment is vastly increasing in U.S. media. In fact, there are 15 billionaires, foreign and domestic, who own and control most of the media, print, web, and TV in the U.S. And so I'm wondering, because they vastly influence how and what news is massaged, portrayed, and released, do you think that there's anything that could or should be done to mitigate this kind of influence? Because most people don't realize the news and entertainment.
I got to let them answer because we're almost out of time.
Okay.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Sure. I'll try to keep this really short. So, I do think there is massive media consolidation. Most media companies, most media that you consume, whether it's film, music, or news, is owned by a handful of companies. That is absolutely true. I would kind of contend, though, that hasn't really driven a sort of political agenda, but it has sort of turned news into more of a commodity so that you actually have to make money. And I think these rich people are more interested in making sure that each of their sectors make money than that they're employing an agenda.
Completely out of time. Thank you.
Sure.
Really appreciate you being with us, Lee Banville. We'll have you back, okay?
Okay, I'll come back.
All right. You guys have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.